welcome to IGB100 at QUT. These videos are designed to allow you to familiarize yourself with Unity by introducing you to fundamental Unity practices during the development of several game types. These practices will be from a technical and art side, allowing programmers, artists, and designers a chance to experiment with all aspects of game development supported by Unity. So first of all, what is Unity? Unity is a game development tool allowing for the easy creation of gameplay mechanics within a pre-built game engine. It is not a 3D modeling programming, a texturing tool, or audio development software, and not really a level design tool. However, it is a useful tool for taking those assets and many others and making a video game with them. However, one of the main focuses of these videos is to show you how to construct games using the basic principles of game object interaction design. You are likely familiar with many mechanics in the various games that you play, but whether you are shooting people in Overwatch, or maybe spinning to win in an ARPG, or just pulling off an awesome finishing move in a fighting game, the majority of the time you are but a game object interacting with other game objects in some way. Throughout the development of 3 different simple games, we will look into ever-increasing complexity in game object interactions. So, without beating around the bush too much, let's just jump straight into Unity. First of all, let's talk about Unity's layout. Now, when you first load up Unity, you'll be presented with something that looks a little bit like this, if not exactly. This is called the default layout of Unity. Now, as you use Unity, you may develop your own preference for where objects need to be placed. I personally use a different layout that's called 2x3. So, within this video series, you'll become accustomed to the 2x3 layout. If you wish to use that layout, feel free. Now, the default setup, or the 2x3 setup as well, has various tabs and windows, some of which will be introduced to you later, but the majority of which are useful to you now are actually visible. The one that we're going to be interacting with most today is what's called the scene view. So on the top left, there'll be this tab called Scene. This scene view represents everything that currently exists in our scene graph, which is actually represented in a hierarchical format within the hierarchy next to it. So if you expand this, you can see that our scene view has a main camera and a directional light. So that we have something that's a little bit more interesting to interact with, I want you to just add a game object, 3D object, cube to your scene, and we'll get this object appearing for us here. Let's talk about some general controls. After you've dropped in the cube, if you select this button in the top left, you will have the ability to translate this cube along the various axes that the game engine supports. Pretty cool. Rotation of this cube is also possible by using the tool next to it, which looks like a little rotation symbol. And you can rotate the cube in a similar fashion. The scaling tool next to that will also do the same thing. These are pretty predictable tools when it comes down to it, but for quick resizing, rescaling, and repositioning of objects, you can get away with them pretty easily. So, in all honesty, those are the general controls of Unity for all game objects that you'll interact with. You'll notice that I'm doing this. Can be done using middle mouse. Additionally, moving the camera around in this fashion can be done by right-clicking on anywhere on the scene and just panning the camera around. So now that we know some basic controls of Unity, let's talk about what's called the inspector view. Now the inspector view is on the far right of this layout, represented here. As you can see, our cube has a series of, we'll call them components. That is actually what they are technically within this game engine. These components represent the properties or aspects of a game object, and they can be almost anything, including scripts. As you can see, this cube has a box collider, has a mesh renderer, has a mesh filter, and most importantly, it has a transform. As you can see, this transform has been modified as we've been moving our cube around. If we just go back and set all of these back to 0, except the scale, we'll put that back on 1, we'll bring our cube back to the point of origin. Now, using this component, the transform component on a game object, is usually a more precise way to get your objects lined up. So take that into consideration. So as I mentioned just before, anything can be a component of an object, including scripts. To illustrate this example, I'm actually just going to make a script by right-clicking on the Assets folder, going to Create, and we'll be using C#. So make a C# script. Let's just call this Test, and reselecting our cube back in the hierarchy, we can simply grab that script and drag it on. We've now attached a component or a script to our game object. Pretty simple. So besides the inspector view, there's also the project tab window. Now this basically is a explorer representation of your project. So wherever your game actually exists on your computer right now, there'll be what's called an assets folder. And inside that assets folder, all we have is this scene, which I've saved beforehand, and our script that we created. Anything that you drag in manually outside of Unity into that assets folder will also get represented there. It'll also appear. It might take a bit of time for Unity to compile it though. In addition to this, we also have the game window. Now this is represented when one or more cameras are visible in the scene. If I move this camera around, you can see that the game world is also changing. It's also adjusting objects with relation to our position of our camera. So that's what you see when you play the game. The one final thing I would like to introduce in this video is the idea of what's called a prefab. So a prefab is a prefabrication of a pre-made object. And we can make a prefab by simply dragging a game object from the scene, or in this case hierarchy, into our assets folder. So if I wanted to make a prefab of this cube, for instance, I'd just simply drag it here. And as you can see, we get a new asset. If I was to delete this cube, I could then reintroduce it back into our scene simply by putting it back in. Now this is useful because it explains a relationship that many game objects have within games. This idea of game objects existing between scenes and being able to be instantiated or spawned on multiple occasions. In this case, this cube can be brought in on many occasions. It's not a simple, unique, standalone object at this point. It's what we call a prefab. So that is basically the Unity interface and some of the more simple elements of it to get you started. I would highly recommend mucking around with Unity in your spare time, and next week we will actually get stuck into making our first game, which in this case will be a shmup.